Hello and welcome to TG Talk, where we talk to the generation about reaching the world for Christ. Hello, I'm Bobby Bosler, and welcome to this episode of TG Talk as we continue our journey of following Paul's confinement in Philippians chapter 1. To view the rest of this series, I just want to say, if you want to check out this playlist right here, you'll be able to catch up on what we've been examining so far here in this series. In just a moment, we're going to be looking at verse 29 in chapter 1. But before we get to that, just to catch you up a little bit, we've been examining Paul, who is in confinement. And most folks would think, Paul's in jail, he's confined, his ministry must be over. However, Paul wanted the Philippians to know, no. Even though I'm in jail, God is moving like I could have never imagined. He's given me opportunities to preach the gospel to the guards, to preach the gospel to Caesar. And in fact, God's using my witness to inspire other people to give their lives for Jesus Christ as well. And honestly, as far as I'm concerned, life is just about surrendering to Jesus' will and depending on his power. And whether I get out of this thing alive or not, I don't care. All I care about is that you Philippians get it in your hearts and in your heads that you have an obligation to preach the gospel as well. Don't worry, you will end up having opposition and backlash, but that's okay. In fact, that's all a part of God's plan. And God's plan is really what verse 29 is all about. Here he's saying God has given us something. Let's look at it. Verse 29, for unto you, Paul says, it is given in the behalf of Christ, not only to believe on him, but also to suffer for his sake. Now here in this verse he said, God has given us something in behalf of Christ. In other words, as we live our lives for Jesus, God has given us two opportunities. Number one, he's given us the opportunity to depend on Jesus. That's what I think he's talking about when he says not only to believe on him. You know, young people, I want you to know that whatever it is you're facing as you pursue the purpose and plan of God, with everything that comes down the pike at you every single day, every single moment, you have an opportunity to depend on Jesus. I think sometimes we look at our lives and our plans and we just think of these things in terms of the drudgeries and the responsibilities and the day in, day out grind of life. But young people, if you will think of every moment and every hour as an opportunity to depend on Jesus and to see Jesus live his loving, supernatural, holy life through you, I'm telling you, you can get excited on a daily basis. But it's really important to understand the context in which he is making this statement, because you can really misunderstand what he's talking about unless you understand what happened before and what he says after this statement. Remember, the verse before, he's essentially telling them, listen, don't be afraid. This opposition that you will experience is a sign from God that these people need Jesus, and it's a sign that you are on the right track. And he says or basically because God's given you the opportunity to depend on Jesus. Now, again, you may not quite be tracking with me yet. We like the first part. God's given you the opportunity to depend on Jesus and to see him do a miracle in your life. But, Mr. Bosler, what about this suffering thing? Well, it's like this. You will not see a miracle unless you need a miracle. Let me put it to you this way. You have an opportunity not only to depend on Jesus, but to have a reason to depend on Jesus. Listen, young people, you can't be victorious unless you need a victory. You can't have a breakthrough unless you have a barrier. You can't see a deliverance unless you need a deliverance. You can't have a solution unless you first have a problem. In other words, he's saying this, listen, don't you understand? You're going to preach the gospel. People are going to get upset and they're going to get mad at you, but that's okay because God has given you the privilege of depending on Jesus and seeing Jesus give a breakthrough as you face every barrier of suffering, of setback, of opposition in your life. So in other words, God's given us two privileges. He's given us the privilege of depending on Jesus for breakthrough. And he's also giving us the privilege of needing a breakthrough in the first place. Young people, I want you to know there are going to be some times in your day today, in your week, when the very reason you were suffering, or the very reason why things got difficult, the very reason why things didn't go the way you thought they were supposed to go, is a privilege. And the reason why God let those things come into your life is because God wanted you to depend on Jesus and to see a breakthrough. You see, suffering is an opportunity for a miracle. And I believe that's what he's talking about here. In other words, in the big context of everything we've talked about up until this point, Paul was in jail and he was suffering. That was a privilege. It was a privilege for him to be in captivity because there in captivity he had an opportunity to depend on Jesus so that Jesus could do a miracle. If Paul was not in captivity, he could not be saying what he was saying here at this point. In fact, that's exactly what verse 30 is talking about. He says, having the same conflict or the same fight or the same struggle which you saw in me and now here to be in me. In other words, he's saying, listen, look at me. Look at me. I am confined in quarantine. I can't go and do what I'm trying to do. There's a sense in which I'm suffering here. And my suffering is an opportunity to see God do a miracle. I was just talking to a preacher just about an hour ago, and I was telling him, I was saying, listen, I believe that this crisis that we're in is one of the greatest opportunities we have ever faced in our lifetime. We look at it and we tend to think, oh, it's bad. And yeah, it is bad from a human standpoint. People are dying. Our economy has ground to a halt. But God is bringing us to this point of suffering because he wants to give us believers the privilege of depending on Jesus to turn our crazy world upside down with the gospel of Jesus Christ. And we're going to be giving you a pretty exciting privilege, Lord willing, next week to directly get involved in this world-changing effort that I'm going to introduce to you next week. I know there are a number of you, you're like, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Well, you'll just have to stay tuned. In fact, you're going to need to hit subscribe down below if you want to know what's happening. And you're probably going to want to hit that bell so that you'll know when I release the next episode. And if you like this video, you can like it. But honestly, young people, more than liking this video, more than subscribing, my burden for you is that you would embrace the opportunity of our collective suffering by depending on Jesus. Hey, thanks so much for watching. We'll see you in the next one.